Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please leave a like and consider subscribing. It takes a second and it helps me a lot. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Starting off, we have the Crippen case. London, England, 1910. The atmosphere of London in 1910 was one of contained, middle-class respectability, particularly in the inner suburbs like Holloway. This was a geography of ordered rows of terraced houses, their uniformity speaking of shared aspiration and rigid social norms. 39. Hilldrop Crescent was one such address, a modest, three-story brick home, unremarkable in every physical sense. The air here carried the fainter, cleaner scent of suburban living. Less coal smoke than the city center, replaced by the smell of domestic cooking and the dampness clinging to small, rear gardens. The soundscape was quiet, defined by the distance from industry. The gentle hush of the wind through the eaves, the soft clack of milk bottles in the morning, and the low, muffled drone of the neighborhood. The light filtering through the lace-curtained windows of Hilldrop Crescent was perpetually dim, suggesting an interior world that was as emotionally contained and airless as its facade suggested. This was a setting where discretion was paramount, and the greatest fear was not violence, but exposure. The inhabitants of 39, Hilldrop Crescent were Drive Holly Harvey Crippen, a diminutive American homeopath whose professional success was minimal, and his second wife, Cora Crippen, stage name Belle Elmore, a loud, ambitious music hall singer whose career was also stalled. The domestic atmosphere was one of profound, corrosive unhappiness, fueled by Cora's public discontent and Crippen's deep, quiet resentment. The geographical nature of the crime, its confinement and careful concealment, began in late January 1910. Cora Crippen vanished after a dinner party with friends. Initially, Dr. Crippen maintained a facade of normalcy, claiming to friends and Cora's music hall associates that she had simply gone to America either to visit a sick relative or to restart her career. The absence of a theatrical personality like Cora was palpable, but in the large, bustling geography of London, the disappearance of an individual, even a moderately known one, could easily be absorbed by the vastness of the city. For months, Crippen lived in the house alone, his initial explanation holding. He even invited his young mistress, Ethel Leneve, to move in, a move of quiet audacity that seemed to confirm Cora's permanent departure. The house at Hilldrop Crescent, previously a site of marital strife, was now a small, private geography of illicit love, all under the cover of a simple lie. The disappearance might have remained a cold case, absorbed by the geography of time and distance, had it not been for the diligence of Cora's friends, who grew suspicious of Crippen's evasive answers and the sudden appearance of his mistress wearing Cora's jewelry. In July 1910, 5 months after Cora's last sighting, they reported their suspicions to Scotland Yard. Chief Inspector Walter Dew was assigned to the case. His initial visit to Hilldrop Crescent was met with Crippen's practiced, calm demeanor. Crippen stuck to his story. Cora had left, and he had simply started a new life. Dew found nothing physically amiss in the house. The geographical silence and order of the suburban home seemed to confirm Crippen's account. Dew, however, maintained a professional skepticism, telling Crippen he would return for a more thorough search. This simple promise was Crippen's undoing. The prospect of a methodical search of the house shattered his composure. On July 9th, Crippen and Leneve fled London entirely. Their flight, rather than proving innocence, confirmed Dew's suspicion of guilt. The systematic search of 39, Hilldrop Crescent, began almost immediately. The house itself was the primary and only crime scene. The search focused not on the grand rooms, but on the subterranean, less frequented parts of the house, the scullery and the coal cellar. The atmosphere of the cellar was confined, damp, and smelled strongly of coal dust. In the small coal cellar, beneath the flagstones, detectives found an area of recently disturbed earth. Below this, only a few feet down, they found the remains. It was not a whole body, but a mass of human tissue and bone fragments, tightly packed and wrapped in pajama cloth. The remains were so mutilated and chemically treated with quicklime that forensic identification was extremely difficult. The careful, subterranean burial in the confined space of the cellar proved Crippen's intent to permanently incorporate his crime into the very foundation of his home. The forensic breakthrough came from three key pieces of evidence recovered from the cellar's contents: a segment of skin with a visible surgical scar, a few strands of hair matching Cora's, and, most critically, traces of the poison hyoscine. This confirmed not only that the remains were Cora Crippen, but that she had been murdered by chemical means before the dismemberment and concealment. The place of the crime, the cellar of 39 Hilldrop Crescent, was inextricably linked to the method of the murder. While the forensic team worked in the cellar, Inspector Dew realized that Crippen and Lou Neve had booked passage on a small ocean liner, the SS Montrose, bound for Quebec, Canada. The geographical setting of the pursuit shifted dramatically from the confined London suburb to the vast, open ocean. In an unprecedented move for the time, Dew utilized the newly invented technology of wireless telegraphy. He telegraphed the captain of the Montrose, informing him that the fugitives were on board and disguised. Lou Neve dressed as a boy. The captain, recognizing the pair from descriptions in the press, discreetly monitored them. This was the first time that wireless communication was used to capture a suspected murderer escaping by sea. Dew boarded a faster liner, the SS Laurentic, which carried him across the Atlantic at a higher speed. The pursuit was a race across geographical space, demonstrating the shrinking scale of the world due to technology. Dew arrived in Quebec first and was there to meet the Montrose when it docked in July 1910. Crippen and Lou Neve were arrested without struggle. The trial was a sensation, focusing on the careful murder, the pathetic dismemberment in the suburban home, and the modern, technological chase across the ocean. Crippen maintained his innocence, but the forensic evidence from the cellar, the small, contained geographical site of the disposal, was overwhelming. He was convicted and hanged in November 1910. Ethel Lou Neve was acquitted of the lesser charge of being an accessory after the fact, allowing her to dissolve back into the London population. The house at 39 Hilldrop Crescent still stands, physically indistinguishable from its neighbors, a testament to the ability of the ordinary suburban geography to conceal extraordinary depravity. The atmosphere today is still one of quiet, pervasive respectability. The murder remains a classic example of a crime of passion and concealment, a dark secret buried beneath the cold dust in a small, forgotten cellar, exposed only through the application of meticulous detective work and the harnessing of new technology to conquer geographical distance. Next story, the murder of Mary Phagan. Atlanta, Georgia, 1913. Georgia, in the spring of 1913, was charged with the restless, tense energy of a rapidly industrializing southern city. The geography was marked by the convergence of commerce and tradition. The air was warm, humid, carrying the scent of red clay and the faint, oily smell of textile machinery mixed with the sweet fragrance of blooming magnolia. This was a place where social lines were rigidly drawn, yet constantly blurred by the influx of factory workers and new money. The specific locus of the crime was the National Pencil Company factory on South Forsyth Street, a multi-story brick structure situated in the heart of Atlanta's industrial district. On this Saturday, April 26th, Confederate Memorial Day, the factory was mostly silent. The soundscape was usually the rhythmic, clattering roar of the machinery, but today, only the distant clank of the streetcar and the faint sounds of celebration from downtown broke the stillness. The light inside the factory, filtering through the high, dirty windows, was dim, uneven, and poorly suited for detail. The victim was Mary Phagan, a 13-year-old girl who worked a 10-hour shift in the pencil factory. She had gone to the factory mid-morning to collect her meager pay of $1.20 from the superintendent. Mary was last seen alive at approximately 12:05 p.m., entering the second-floor office of the factory superintendent, Leo Frank. Leo Frank, a Cornell-educated Jewish northerner, was an anomaly in the southern industrial landscape, a meticulous, reserved man who managed the factory. He was the last known person to see Mary Phagan. The discovery was made early the following morning, Sunday, April 27th. A watchman, Newt Lee, investigating a noise in the basement, found the body of the girl near a pile of coal and industrial debris. The factory basement was a confined, humid space, perpetually dark, smelling of dust, damp concrete, and chemicals. The geography of the basement, its isolation, and its labyrinthine clutter of unused machinery and storage provided the final, tragic screen for the crime. The body was found wrapped in a piece of tow sack. She had been severely beaten about the head and appeared to have been sexually assaulted. Beside her was a note, crudely written on a scrap of paper, suggesting the crime was committed by the watchman. The initial reaction of the police, focused on the immediate geographical scene, was to arrest Newt Lee. The investigation quickly shifted its focus to Leo Frank. He was questioned immediately, and his detached, nervous demeanor, coupled with his position and his identity as a Northern Jew, made him an immediate target in the racially and socially charged atmosphere of Atlanta. The police, facing intense public pressure, soon focused on a singular theory. Frank, the educated outsider, was the killer. The primary witness who sealed the official narrative was James Jim Conley, a black janitor who worked at the factory. Conley was initially arrested for drunkenness and later claimed to have been in the factory on the day of the murder. His story, which changed multiple times under police pressure, eventually settled on the claim that he witnessed Leo Frank bringing Mary Phagan's body down to the basement and coercing Conley into writing the incriminating note found beside the body. The narrative presented Conley as an accessory forced to conceal the crime of his white employer. The trial of Leo Frank, which began in July 1913, became less a search for forensic truth and more a reflection of the deep-seated geographical and social prejudices of the time. The courthouse was surrounded by an angry, volatile mob, whose presence and shouts of "Hang the Jew" permeated the courtroom, influencing the jury. The forensic evidence was complex and contradictory. The time of death, the location of the hair strands, and the nature of the wounds were all subject to expert interpretation. However, in the highly charged atmosphere, the testimony of Jim Conley, the local, poor, black man whose story played perfectly into the existing cultural anxieties about Northern industrialists, was given more weight than the complex, circumstantial evidence against Frank. Frank's defense pointed to the inconsistencies in Conley's shifting narrative, suggesting Conley himself was the killer and was using the prevailing racial and social tensions to deflect suspicion. However, in the geographical and emotional context of the Atlanta courtroom in 1913, the jury found Frank guilty. He was sentenced to death. The case, however, refused to die. The years that followed were defined by a relentless legal battle. Key figures, including the original prosecutor and a number of prominent Atlanta citizens, became convinced of Frank's innocence and Conley's guilt. The core issue remained the reliability of Conley's testimony, which was based entirely on the geography of the factory and the sequence of events in the dark, confined basement. In 1915, 2 years after the initial conviction, Frank's final appeal to the Supreme Court failed. Recognizing the deep flaws in the case and the intense, intimidating atmosphere of the trial, Governor John M. Slayton, on his last day in office, commuted Frank's sentence to life imprisonment, moving him from the confines of the Fulton Tower Prison to the relative security of the state prison farm in Milledgeville, deep in the state's interior. This act of commutation, though legally sound, ignited a firestorm of public outrage in the geographical heart of Atlanta. The perceived betrayal of Southern justice led to the formation of a vigilante group, calling themselves the Knights of Mary Phagan. On the night of August 16, 1915, a well-organized mob of armed men, acting with chilling precision, invaded the Milledgeville prison farm, a site far removed from the city, thought to be secure by its geographical isolation. They kidnapped Leo Frank, transported him over 150 miles across rural Georgia back towards Atlanta, and eventually to a point outside Marietta, Mary Phagan's hometown. The atmosphere of the rural countryside in the early morning hours was one of deep, conspiratorial darkness. On August 17th, Leo Frank was lynched from an oak tree. The act was conducted with chilling efficiency and silence, far removed from the legal structures of the city, yet entirely born from the city's prejudice. The enduring mystery of the Mary Phagan case is not who committed the murder, which the historical consensus now overwhelmingly points toward Jim Conley. The enduring quality is the chilling demonstration of how deeply prejudice and geographical proximity can influence the outcome of justice. Jim Conley was eventually paroled, living out the rest of his life as a free man. The factory on South Forsyth Street is long gone. The Atlanta of today is a high-tech metropolis, but the place where the original crime occurred is still marked by the busy streets of the city center. The murder of Mary Phagan, forever tied to the geographical and social atmosphere of Atlanta in 1913, remains a scar on the history of American justice. A reminder of how a dark, confined space in a factory basement became the stage for a tragedy whose impact extended far beyond the city limits, culminating in a final act of violence committed under the absolute darkness of a rural Georgia night. Next story, The Brides and the Bath Murders. England, 1912 to 1915. The Brides and the Bath Murders were not confined to a single dramatic location like a basement or a factory, but were instead defined by the banal, ordinary geometry of middle-class domesticity across several southern English towns. The setting was the rental home, the boarding house, and the essential, ubiquitous feature of any dwelling, the bathtub. The years between 1912 and 1915 saw England settled into a pre-war stillness, soon to be shattered. The atmosphere in these homes was one of quiet, transient respectability. The air smelled of cheap soap, slightly stale cooking, and the pervasive dampness of poorly heated brick houses. The soundscape was defined by the dull, familiar noises of domestic life. The creak of the floorboards, the sizzle of a gas ring, and most critically, the distinct, rushing sound of water filling a porcelain tub. The lighting was the dim, yellow glow of electric or gaslight, casting heavy shadows in the narrow hallways and small, confined bathrooms. The central figure in this series of tragedies was George Joseph Smith, a charming, smooth-talking conman and bigamist. Smith's method was built entirely on a foundation of deception, moving constantly across the geographical space of England to find new victims and establish new, temporary identities. His victims were vulnerable women of some means, often lonely or with small inheritances. Smith would marry them, quickly secure control of their assets through fraudulent wills or insurance policies, and then arrange for their swift, silent termination. The murder weapon was not a blunt instrument or poison, but the most seemingly harmless feature of the domestic environment: water. The pattern began in Blackpool. In December 1913, Smith married Beatrice Constance Annie Mundy, a woman with a small trust fund. On December 13th, less than 2 weeks after their marriage, Beatrice was found dead in the bathtub of their rented accommodation. Smith claimed to the local doctor that she had suffered an epileptic fit. The doctor, lacking suspicion and confronted with the confined, wet geography of the scene, accepted the explanation. The death certificate was issued, and Smith inherited her estate. The second victim, Alice Burnham, married Smith in June 1914. Again, a small fortune was secured. This time, the location was Highgate, London, a more respectable but equally anonymous setting. On December 12, 1914, exactly 1 year after the first death, Alice was found dead in her bath. Smith once again orchestrated the scene, claiming an epileptic fit and securing a death certificate. The geographical similarity, the victim found drowned in the contained space of a porcelain tub, was the only link, yet it remained unnoticed by the geographically separate police forces. The third, and ultimately fatal, repetition occurred in Southend-on-Sea, Essex. Smith married Margaret Elizabeth Lofty in December 1914, just weeks after Alice Burnham's death. Margaret, too, possessed a modest sum. On December 18, 1914, Margaret was found dead in her bath. The close clustering of the deaths in time. 3 wives, all marrying Smith, all dying in the bathtub, was statistically impossible but geographically dispersed enough to be treated as separate, tragic accidents by 3 different constabularies. The silence of the domestic scene had protected the killer. The geographical distance between the crimes, Blackpool in the north, Highgate in London, and Southend-on-Sea on the coast, was a most ingenious aspect of Smith's plan. The police forces of each jurisdiction had no mechanism to link these spatially disparate deaths. The pattern was finally broken not by an internal police review, but by the relentless curiosity of a concerned citizen. The brother of the second victim, Alice Burnham, read a newspaper report about the death of Margaret Lofty in Southend, noting the strange similarity: a newly married woman, a large insurance policy, and a death in the bathtub. He immediately wrote a letter to Scotland Yard, detailing the eerie coincidence. This led to the investigation being unified under one geographical command, the Central Authority of Scotland Yard. Detectives began the meticulous, slow process of excavating the past lives of George Joseph Smith and tracing his movements across the country. They discovered a long history of bigamy, fraud, and the sudden, profitable deaths of his spouses, all linked by the contained geographical space of the tub. The key to prosecution lay in demonstrating the common mechanism of death across the geographically separated scenes. Since there were no signs of external injury or forced struggle, the murder had to be swift, silent, and internal. The police, using expert witnesses and even conducting horrifying, controversial experiments using live female subjects and a period bathtub, determined that Smith's method was a highly specialized technique. It involved suddenly gripping the victim's ankles, jerking their legs upwards, and plunging the head violently underwater in the confined space of the tub. The surprise and the instantaneous physical disorientation caused immediate drowning and heart failure, leaving virtually no trace of violence or struggle on the body. The small, wet geometry of the bathroom was both the crime scene and the erasure mechanism. The trial of George Joseph Smith in 1915 was a national sensation, dominated by the macabre commonality of the deaths. The prosecution brilliantly connected the 3 geographically distinct accidents into a single, terrifying pattern of deliberate murder. The small, ordinary domestic space, the rented room, the bathroom, the tub, was transformed from a place of refuge into a killing machine. Smith was convicted and hanged. The case stands as one of the most famous early examples of utilizing pattern recognition across multiple, geographically separated jurisdictions to prove the existence of a serial killer. Today, the houses where the women died are regular suburban homes, silent and anonymous. Yet, the atmosphere of the crime remains tied to the sound of running water in an empty house. The enduring terror lies in the realization that the most ordinary, enclosed, and domestic of geographical spaces, the bathroom, could be silently and repeatedly utilized as the perfect, untraceable chamber of murder. The simplicity and the universality of the setting were the killer's most effective tools against the sprawling, decentralized nature of early 20th century police work. Next story, the Hall Mills murder case. New Brunswick, New Jersey, in the early autumn of 1922 was a mix of suburban quiet and academic reserve, being the home of Rutgers University. Outside the city center, the landscape quickly dissolved into agricultural land and dense, wooded ravines. The air, particularly in the secluded areas along the Raritan River, was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, damp soil, and the vegetal aroma of the surrounding farmlands. The crime scene was situated in a particularly isolated spot, an abandoned, overgrown farm field near DeRussey's Lane, adjacent to the sprawling tracts of farmland and roughly 3 miles from the center of New Brunswick. This remote, natural geography was the perfect screen for a clandestine meeting and, ultimately, a violent act. The soundscape here was dominated by the natural world, the rustling of brush, the chirping of crickets, and the profound, oppressive silence of the countryside at night, which absorbed human sound instantly. The only light was the cold, indifferent glow of the moon, filtering through the branches of the sycamore and crabapple trees that bordered the lane. The victims were Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, 41, the rector of the Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist in New Brunswick, and Eleanor Reinhardt Mills, 34, a choir singer and wife of the church's sexton. They were engaged in a long-running, secret affair, a breach of the rigid social geography of their town that had to be contained within the silent, physical geography of the isolated countryside. The bodies were discovered on the morning of Saturday, September 16, 1922, by a passing couple walking their dog. The scene was one of staged, chilling intimacy. The victims were found side by side, positioned beneath a crabapple tree. They had been shot multiple times. The Reverend Hall had a fatal bullet wound to the head, and his body was found with his left hand placed under the back of the woman's neck. Eleanor Mills had been shot 3 times, and her throat was cut. Both had their visiting cards placed near their feet. The geographical details of the discovery were key to the ensuing mystery. A heavy branch had been broken off the crabapple tree and placed across the bodies. Scattered around the scene were remnants of a picnic, suggesting the meeting had been planned. Most notably, love letters, evidence of the affair, were meticulously torn up and placed near the bodies. The small geographical area of the crime scene was not immediately secured with the forensic rigor required. Curious citizens and press quickly flooded the site, contaminating crucial evidence. However, one specific piece of evidence, a single visiting card belonging to Eleanor Mills, was placed resting against the sole of her shoe. On the card, someone had written the letter H in what appeared to be a woman's handwriting. The investigation, driven by the sensational nature of the affair between a prominent minister and a choir member, immediately focused on the victim's spouses. The central suspects were Frances Noel Stevens Hall, Mrs. Hall, and her 2 brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens, along with Jim Mills, the victim's husband. The geographical and social center of the case quickly shifted from the remote lane to the Stevens family estate. Deacon's Hill, a large, rambling house that represented old New Brunswick wealth and social rigidity. Mrs. Hall and her brothers provided a joint alibi, claiming they were together at Deacon's Hill on the night of the murder. The first investigation was haphazard and lacked focus. Initially, no one was charged, and the case grew cold, absorbed by the routine life of the town and the vastness of the American justice system. The geographical evidence of the crime, however, was later dramatically reintroduced by a witness known as the Pig Woman, Jane Gibson. Gibson lived in a small shack near the murder scene, a geographical isolate. In 1926, 4 years after the crime, the sensationalist press revived the case, and Gibson came forward with a story that electrified the nation. Gibson claimed that on the night of the murder, she was riding her donkey near DeRussey's Lane, looking for stray pigs, when she saw a car parked near the crabapple tree. She claimed to have witnessed the figures of 4 people, 2 men and 2 women, arguing. She specifically identified Mrs. Hall, her 2 brothers, and a 4th unidentified woman. Hearing a woman shout, "Explain this letter," before the shots rang out. Based almost entirely on the testimony of Jane Gibson, who was brought to the trial on a stretcher due to a recurring illness, the case was reopened, and Frances Hall and her 2 brothers were indicted for the murders. The trial of 1926 was a cultural and geographical spectacle, bringing the intense media spotlight from New York into the quiet New Jersey courthouse. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the Pig Woman's testimony, the theory that Mrs. Hall had killed her rival and her husband in a fit of jealous rage, and the geographical isolation of the murder scene. The defense, led by a formidable legal team, meticulously dissected the geographical and physical evidence. They argued that Jane Gibson's shack was too far away for her to have clearly seen or heard the events. They pointed out that the Deacon's Hill estate was large, and its inhabitants could not possibly have coordinated their movements so precisely. Crucially, they focused on the lack of blood or definitive forensic evidence linking the Stevens family to the remote lane. The most iconic piece of physical evidence presented was a single, shredded love letter found at the scene, which the prosecution claimed was the letter referred to by the Pig Woman. The mystery remained how the 4 individuals, 2 victims and 2 alleged perpetrators, arrived at and left the secluded geographical setting. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty for Frances Hall and her brothers. The sheer power of their family's social standing and the lack of strong, undeniable forensic evidence trumped the sensational but unreliable testimony of the pig woman. The Hall Mills murder remains officially unsolved. The truth of who fired the shots and how the four individuals came to be arranged in that remote field is a secret that died beneath the crabapple tree. Today, the geographical setting of DeRussey's Lane is still a quiet, somewhat overgrown area, though now surrounded by suburban development. The site of the crabapple tree, which was repeatedly vandalized by souvenir hunters, is long gone. Yet, the story is permanently etched into the local history, a chilling reminder of how a single, remote geographical spot, chosen for the secrecy it promised, became the site of a double murder that exposed the poisonous hypocrisy and deep, rigid social strata of a small American city. The secrets of the human heart, played out in the profound silence of the countryside, were never fully revealed. Next story, the murder of William Desmond Taylor. Los Angeles, 1922. The crime unfolded in Westlake Park, an exclusive residential enclave marked by stucco bungalows and modest apartment buildings, deliberately set apart from the relentless pace of the nearby studios. By day, the area was bathed in warm, golden light slipping between the palm trees. But on the night of February 1st, 1922, that familiarity dissolved, replaced by the false anonymity of a clear, cold Los Angeles night. William Desmond Taylor, 49, was a prominent and well-liked film director, a handsome, charming, and meticulous man whose life was, like the industry itself, a blend of public spectacle and private secrets. He lived in a quiet, ground-floor apartment at 404 Beat Alvarado Court. The soundscape of the evening was quiet, composed of the distant, muted drone of the city and the localized sounds of domesticity. The low murmur of conversations, the soft thud of a closing door, the occasional passing car. This was a geography designed for relaxation and discretion, ensuring that any single sharp noise would be swallowed quickly by the surrounding stucco and foliage. Taylor was last seen alive at approximately 7:45 p.m. on the evening of February 1st. He was visited by his neighbor and close friend, the silent film star Mabel Normand, who spent a cheerful few minutes with him before departing to return to her own apartment a few blocks away. Her departure was witnessed, her presence a fact of record. The body was discovered the following morning, Thursday, February 2nd, around 7:30 a.m., by Taylor's Japanese valet, Henry Peavy, who arrived to prepare breakfast. Taylor was found sprawled face up on the living room floor of his apartment. The crime scene, initially observed by the excited valet, was immediately and tragically compromised. Peavy, in his panic, touched and moved things. Most fatally, a passing doctor, attracted by the commotion, mistakenly assumed Taylor had died of a sudden hemorrhage and ordered the body moved onto the couch. This single, critical mistake, the movement of the body, destroyed the initial geographical relationship between the victim and the evidence. When police finally arrived, the scene was a mess of misinformation and displaced objects. The first and most significant forensic reality was the cause of death. Taylor had been shot once in the back, the bullet entering the upper spine. The wound was not visible from the front, explaining the doctor's initial confusion. The official search of the geographically confined apartment revealed a number of unusual, contradictory details. The missing wallet, Taylor's pockets were empty, suggesting robbery, but the director had been known to carry a large amount of cash. The handkerchief, a small, white silk handkerchief, embroidered with the letter M in dark blue, was found near the body. It was spotted with a dark, oily substance. The bullet was never recovered from the scene, suggesting the killer used a low-caliber weapon or that the bullet passed cleanly through the body and was removed by the killer or someone else. The dress, a piece of a woman's embroidered lingerie or dress, was later found snagged on the door latch outside the apartment. The investigation quickly moved beyond the geographical bounds of the apartment into the turbulent, secretive atmosphere of Hollywood. The inquiry revealed that Taylor was living a complex double life, managing multiple secret affairs, carrying on clandestine correspondence, and, most surprisingly, possibly working undercover for federal agents to expose drug trafficking within the film industry. The geographical distance of the key suspect from the crime scene was a central problem. Mabel Normand, the last known person to see him alive. Her emotional behavior and her admitted heavy drug use created suspicion, but her alibi was solid. Mary Miles Minter, a teenage starlet obsessed with Taylor, known to have written him passionate letters. Her mother, Charlotte Shelby, was violently opposed to the relationship. Edward Sands, Taylor's former valet, who had been fired and harbored intense resentment. Henry Peavy, the current valet, whose inconsistent statements and immediate contamination of the scene raised questions. The police were flooded with contradictory statements and deliberately confusing leads from the studio system, whose executives were terrified of the damaging publicity. The atmosphere of public panic, driven by the sensational press, was immense. The most intense focus eventually settled on the relationship between Taylor and the volatile, possessive mother of Mary Miles Minter, Charlotte Shelby. Shelby was known to be intensely jealous and had a history of carrying a small, pearl-handled pistol. Her motive was clear: to eliminate the man who she feared would ruin her daughter's career and life. However, the forensic chain of evidence was irreparably broken by the initial movement of the body. The small, crucial space near the entrance door, which might have yielded prints or the spent shell casing, was destroyed. The embroidered handkerchief was eventually traced to Charlotte Shelby, and the piece of dress fabric was speculated to be hers, but no direct, irrefutable link, no physical evidence that transcended the circumstantial, could ever be established. The case remained cold, never resulting in a conviction. The death of William Desmond Taylor, shrouded in the secrecy and lies of Hollywood, became the defining mystery of early cinema. The apartment complex at Alvarado Court still exists, though the neighborhood has changed entirely. The geographical location, a quiet, sun-drenched, palm-lined residential corner, belies the violence and the complexity of the crime. The lasting quality of the case is the chilling fact that the power of the social atmosphere, the fear of scandal in Hollywood, was so great that it successfully overwhelmed and suppressed the physical evidence, preventing the murder from ever being solved. The secrets of the film industry, guarded by its own protective geography of silence and deception, proved more durable than the law. Next story, the Fatty Arbuckle case. San Francisco, 1921. In September 1921, San Francisco was defined by post-war exuberance and a moral landscape in quiet transition. The city's steep hills and persistent, damp fog lent an air of refinement that concealed a vigorous Prohibition-era underworld. The climate remained cool, the air layered with the bite of the Pacific, the gritty scent of cable car brake dust, and a faint metallic note rising from the city's dense framework. The events themselves were centered on the 12th floor of the St. Francis Hotel, a prestigious and centrally placed fixture overlooking Union Square. It was a realm of carefully contained luxury, engineered to keep its high-profile guests beyond public reach. Even in daylight, illumination was subdued, filtered through fog or absorbed by heavy velvet drapes. Sound traveled softly here. The dull pulse of elevators, the distant clang of cable cars below, and the constant, low murmur of voices drifting through private gatherings. Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, one of the biggest and most beloved silent film comedians in the world, was staying in a luxurious suite for a celebratory Labor Day weekend on his way to make a film in the city. The geographical confinement of the suite became the stage for a 3-day, non-stop party, fueled by illegal alcohol and the hedonistic atmosphere of the Jazz Age. The events that led to the central mystery occurred on Labor Day, Monday, September 5th. Virginia Rapp, a 26-year-old actress and model who was a guest at the party, began to complain of severe abdominal pain. The specific sequence of events leading up to her collapse in the contained space of the suite remains the core of the controversy. The initial geographical containment of the scene, the private suite, led to immediate confusion and misdiagnosis. Rapp was moved from the bathroom, where she collapsed, to a bed. Instead of calling for immediate, high-level medical aid, the party guests, fearful of a scandal that would expose illegal liquor and illicit behavior, attempted to treat Rapp themselves. Her worsening condition was blamed on a combination of drunkenness and nerves. Rapp was eventually taken to the hotel doctor, then to a private room, and finally, 3 days later, to a hospital outside the immediate geographical perimeter of the hotel, where she tragically died on September 9th. The forensic reality revealed that the hospital was devastating. The official cause of death was peritonitis, resulting from a ruptured bladder. The medical examination showed signs of extreme internal injury to her pelvic area. The initial theory put forth by the autopsy surgeon, Dr. George L. Christian, was that the injury was caused by a massive external trauma, suggesting a violent assault. Based on the highly suggestive, though circumstantial, testimony of a woman named Maud Delmont, another guest at the party who claimed Arbuckle had violently assaulted Rapp in the bedroom. Roscoe Arbuckle was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The geographical intimacy of the crime, a violent assault occurring in the confined space of a hotel bedroom, was enough for the initial charge. The subsequent investigation revealed the immense geographical constraints and opportunities for evidence manipulation posed by the city's social strata. Arbuckle, a wealthy film star, was placed under immediate public scrutiny, but his resources allowed him to assemble a formidable defense team. The studios, terrified of the public relations disaster, began an immediate campaign to suppress information. The trial, held in San Francisco, became a national obsession, transforming from a forensic inquiry into a moral and geographical condemnation of Hollywood excess. The prosecution's case centered on the violence and the testimony of Delmont, arguing that Arbuckle's size and weight were the external force that caused the rupture. The atmosphere of public outrage against Hollywood's perceived immorality made Arbuckle's conviction seem inevitable. The defense, however, introduced critical forensic and medical testimony that challenged the initial geographical and medical assumptions. They argued that Rapp had a history of chronic cystitis, a severe bladder condition, and that her internal organs were already weakened. The key medical contention was that a ruptured bladder, even one causing peritonitis, was not necessarily caused by external trauma. It could be exacerbated by extreme intoxication and the resulting self-inflicted struggles of the victim. The medical experts for the defense argued that Rapp's injuries could have been sustained in a variety of ways during her violent fits of pain and subsequent thrashing. Critically, the geographical separation of the crime scene, the hotel, and the definitive forensic scene, the hospital, 3 days later, had severely complicated the chain of evidence. The initial movement of the body and the lack of immediate, high-quality medical care in the initial 72 hours were deemed massive failures of protocol. The prosecution failed to produce any definitive physical evidence. No cuts, no bruises, no external marks of the alleged massive trauma that could prove the assault took place as described. The single most compelling geographical fact, the location of the collapse in the bathroom, remained confusing. Arbuckle endured not one, but 3 highly publicized trials. The first 2 resulted in hung juries, reflecting the deep division between the public's moral condemnation of his lifestyle and the legal community's skepticism of the actual forensic evidence. The third trial, in 1922, ended with a verdict of not guilty. The jury issued an unprecedented statement of apology to Arbuckle, declaring that a great injustice has been done to him. Despite the acquittal, the damage to Arbuckle's life was complete. The moral panic and the power of the press, fueled by the geographical proximity of Hollywood's scandal to the American heartland, led Will Hayes, the film censor, to ban Arbuckle's films entirely. The St. Francis Hotel suite where the party took place is now an ordinary, anonymous room. The atmosphere of jazz-age recklessness has been replaced by modern, corporate luxury. The core mystery of the Arbuckle case is permanently located in the medical uncertainty. Was the rupture caused by a moment of violent criminal behavior in the confined space of a hotel bedroom? Or was it the tragic, fatal consequence of a pre-existing medical condition exacerbated by the reckless, illegal atmosphere of a Prohibition-era party? The lack of definitive forensic evidence in the geographically compromised scene ensures the question will never be definitively answered. Next story, the Leopold and Loeb case. Chicago, Illinois, 1924. In the spring of 1924, Chicago projected an air of sharpened intellect intertwined with extraordinary affluence. Its social order was tightly stratified, yet the city also served as a breeding ground for bold, unsettling ideas, many of them radiating from the University of Chicago. The atmosphere was unmistakably urban, coal smoke lingering in the streets, tempered by the clean, cold breath drifting in from Lake Michigan. At the center of the perpetrator's world lay Kenwood, an elite residential enclave marked by imposing mansions and carefully kept lawns, where privilege was assumed and exceptionalism was quietly demanded. Nathan Leopold, 19, and Richard Loeb, 18, were two of the most intellectually gifted young men in the city, products of this rarefied environment. Leopold was a graduate of the University of Chicago and a student at Harvard Law, fascinated by philosophy, criminology, and Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch Superman. Loeb was the youngest graduate of the University of Michigan, obsessed with detective fiction and the thrill of orchestrating the perfect crime. Their relationship was built on a shared arrogance and the desire to prove their intellectual superiority by committing a crime that would transcend the ordinary and baffle law enforcement. The crime was motivated not by passion or profit, but by this intellectual conceit. The two spent months planning the perfect geographical execution of the act, scouting locations, and devising methods of disposal that relied on the city's vast, impersonal geography to provide cover. The victim was Robert Bobby Franks, 14, a distant cousin of Richard Loeb, and a boy who shared their privileged geographical setting. On the afternoon of Wednesday, May 21st, 1924, Leopold and Loeb rented a maroon, four-cylinder Willis Knight touring car. They drove through the streets of Kenwood and spotted Bobby Franks walking home from school. They lured him into the car under false pretenses. The murder was committed almost immediately after the abduction, inside the confined, moving geographical space of the car. The mechanism of death was a swift, crushing blow to the head with a chisel delivered by Loeb. To ensure the body was not traced, they then forced a gag down the victim's throat and placed his corpse beneath a blanket on the floor of the back seat. The next phase was the disposal, the complex geographical stage of their perfect crime. The car, with the body concealed inside, was driven south out of the immediate urban geography of Chicago, past the lights and noise, into the remote, desolate regions of Gary, Indiana, a distance of over 25 miles. This act of geographical displacement was designed to confuse investigators and place the crime outside the immediate jurisdiction of Chicago police. In a secluded area near the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks in a desolate marshland, the murderers stripped the body, poured hydrochloric acid over the face and identifying scars to chemically erase identity, and placed the remains in a large, subterranean drainage culvert, a ditch for carrying water beneath a road. The body was wedged deep into the contained, dark, concrete tunnel. They then returned to Chicago, disposing of the car's blood-stained interior parts and clothing along the way. The atmosphere of the following morning was defined by the search for the missing boy. The immediate family received a ransom note, which Leopold and Loeb had mailed, demanding a sizable sum of money. The note was an elaborate deception, designed to suggest the boy was alive and had been kidnapped by professional criminals. The geographical stage of the crime, however, was quickly compromised. The body was discovered on May 22nd, only hours after it was dumped by a Polish laborer, Tony Monk, who was walking through the desolate marshland. The geographical remoteness that Leopold and Loeb had banked on failed them. The culvert was not as hidden as they had believed. The crucial forensic reality discovered at the scene was a pair of eyeglasses found near the body. They were a distinctive pair of horn-rimmed glasses secured by a gold chain that had a unique geographical signature. The hinge on the left temple was attached with an unusual, patented fastening mechanism, manufactured by a specialized Chicago optician and sold only to 3 customers, one of whom was Nathan Leopold. This single piece of physical evidence, which had fallen from the killer's pocket, was the thread that pulled the entire complex conspiracy apart. When confronted with the evidence, Leopold and Loeb, relying on their belief in their own intellectual supremacy, initially created an elaborate lie about the car being stolen and used by others. But under relentless, methodical interrogation by State's Attorney Robert E. Crowe, their alibis cracked. Richard Loeb confessed, placing the blame on Leopold. Leopold then confessed, placing the ultimate blame on Loeb. The trial, held in Chicago, became a massive geographical and cultural event, bringing the famed defense attorney Clarence Darrow to the city. Darrow, though unable to argue innocence, fought fiercely to save the young men from the death penalty, arguing that their extreme youth and the debilitating influence of their wealth and intellectual atmosphere, the very geography of their privilege, made them mentally unfit for execution. His closing argument, delivered over 12 hours, became an American legal landmark. Darrow succeeded. The boys were sentenced to life in prison. The conviction was based on the undeniable physical evidence and the geography of the disposal in the Gary culvert. Richard Loeb was killed in prison in 1936. Nathan Leopold, after 33 years in prison, was paroled and went on to live a quiet life of service, dying in 1971. The geographical site of the murder, the culvert in the Indiana marsh, has long since been paved over and absorbed into modern industrial growth. The atmosphere of the place is entirely changed. Yet, the story remains a defining study of the failure of intellectual arrogance. The 2 brilliant young men, confident that their wealth and education provided an impenetrable shield, failed to account for the single, tiny physical vulnerability, a pair of eyeglasses that slipped out of a pocket in the desolate, damp geometry of an Indiana drainage culvert, leading the law directly from the remote disposal site back to the privileged geography of Chicago's Kenwood. Next story, the Wineville Chicken Coop Murders. Wineville, California, 1928. In the late 1920s, Wineville, California existed in a state of deep rural stillness. Tucked into Riverside County's Cucamonga Valley, the settlement, small, isolated, and later renamed Mira Loma to escape the shadow of what occurred there, was shaped by wide, flat stretches of arid land. Life revolved around poultry farms, vineyards, and long expanses of untended brush. The atmosphere was unmistakable, dry air thick with dust, the sharp odor of chicken coops, earth baked hard by the sun, and drifting in from distance, the subtle sweetness of nearby citrus trees. The soundscape was typical of isolated farmland. The incessant, high-pitched caw of chickens, the distant putt-putt of irrigation pumps, and the overwhelming, heavy silence that fell at dusk. This remoteness was its most critical feature, a geography where neighbors were separated by large tracts of land, and where the cries of a child would simply be absorbed by the vast, unpopulated space. The central figure in the horror was Gordon Stewart Northcott, a seemingly harmless young man who lived with his mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, on their small ranch outside Wineville proper. The Northcott property was itself a geographical isolate, a cluster of rudimentary structures, including a small house and several large, densely packed chicken coops, situated away from main roads and surrounded by empty land. The crime began as a series of abductions targeting young boys, usually transients or children from impoverished families, in the bustling geographical environment of Los Angeles, approximately 50 miles away. Northcott would lure them, promising work or a ride, and bring them back to the contained, secret geography of his ranch. The atrocities took place within the structures of the Northcott Ranch, primarily in a small, windowless cabin on the property and the chicken coops themselves. The geographical proximity of the chicken farm provided the perfect cover for the sounds of violence. The constant, High-volume noise of hundreds of chickens masked any human sounds that might travel across the open land. The atmosphere of the site was one of deliberate sensory distraction. The full scale of Northcote's crimes, committed with the assistance of his mother and often his nephew, Sanford Clark, is difficult to ascertain, but he was eventually linked to the murder of at least 20 young boys between 1926 and 1928. The particular mystery that broke the case involved the disappearance of the 3 sons of Christine Collins from Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Police Department, under intense public pressure, initially handled the case with incompetence. They attempted to solve the case by presenting Christine Collins with a boy who they knew was not her son, a ruse that eventually discredited the LAPD but had no direct bearing on the geographical location of the murders. The breakthrough that directed attention to the isolated Wineville ranch came not from the LAPD, but from the escape and testimony of Sanford Clark, Northcote's teenage nephew. Clark had been brought from Canada and forced to assist and witness the abductions and murders. In August 1928, Clark escaped and fled to Canada, where he was apprehended. Under questioning, he revealed the unimaginable horror that had taken place in the quiet, isolated geography of the Wineville Ranch. The subsequent investigation immediately shifted to the Northcote property. The search of the ranch, the physical geography of the murder site, was slow and gruesome. The searchers, guided by Clark's horrifying descriptions, found axes, instruments of torture, and bloodstains in the small cabin and barn. The most crucial forensic evidence was found in the wide geographical area of the surrounding property, particularly in the vicinity of the chicken coops and the dry creek bed. The disposal method, typical of a rural environment, relied on shallow burial and the use of quicklime. The investigators exhumed the shallow graves, finding the fragmentary remains of multiple victims, confirming the testimony of Sanford Clark. However, the remains were so badly decomposed and fragmented that definitively identifying all the victims proved impossible. 3 of the bodies were identified as the 3 missing boys from the same family, 2 brothers and their friend. The case of Christine Collins' son, Walter, was also tragically linked to the ranch through circumstantial evidence, though his remains were never definitively identified among the fragments. The Northcotes, having realized the investigation was closing in, fled the state and were later apprehended near Vernon, British Columbia, Canada, having relied on the geographical distance and anonymity to escape. The atmosphere of Wineville was forever shattered by the revelations. The community, desperate to erase the stain of the horror, took a drastic geographical measure. They petitioned to change the town's name, successfully renaming it Mira Loma in 1930. The subsequent trial of Gordon Stewart Northcote was a closed affair, driven by the need to prevent the further spread of the gruesome details. He was convicted of the murders of the 3 boys whose remains could be positively linked to the ranch. He was executed in San Quentin Prison in 1930. Sarah Louise Northcote, who confessed to killing the Collins boy, Walter, was sentenced to life in prison. The Northcote Ranch was razed to the ground, and the land was sold to eliminate the physical trace of the atrocities. Today, the geographical area of Mira Loma is densely built up, having been subsumed by the relentless expansion of the Los Angeles exurbs. The enduring mystery of the Wineville Chicken Coop Murders is the precise number of victims and the total erasure of their identities due to the disposal methods. The case remains a dark study of geographical exploitation, how the silence, vastness, and agricultural smells of a remote, quiet rural community provided the perfect, sustained cover for a methodical serial killer, and how the anonymity of the American road allowed the killer to transport his young victims, unnoticed, from the bustle of the city to the profound, fatal isolation of the chicken ranch. The constant, high-volume noise of the farm animals was the ultimate, living sound barrier for the murders. Next story, the disappearance of Natalie Holloway, Oranjestad, Aruba, 2005. Picture the island of Aruba as it appeared in the late spring of 2005, a place where the jagged limestone cliffs of the north coast stand in stark contrast to the sugar-white sands of the south. The atmosphere is defined by the One Happy Island motto, a landscape of DVDV trees leaning perpetually toward the turquoise Caribbean, vibrant with the scent of tropical bougainvillea and the steady, cooling trade winds. Oranjestad, the capital, was a kaleidoscope of pastel-colored Dutch colonial buildings that glowed in the relentless golden sun. In late May, the island became a sanctuary for hundreds of American high school seniors celebrating their graduation. The mood was one of sun-drenched freedom, a rhythmic cycle of beach excursions by day and the neon-lit pulse of the Palm Beach district by night. In this setting, the very concept of danger felt impossible, masked by the bright holiday light. Natalie Holloway was an 18-year-old from Mountain Brook, Alabama, characterized by those who knew her as driven, high-achieving, and possessing a vibrant, empathetic spirit. She arrived on the island with her classmates, moving through the resort world of the holiday and with the effortless confidence of a young woman on the cusp of a university life. On the final night of the trip, May 30th, the students gathered at Carlos and Charlie's, a popular downtown venue, where the air was thick with the humidity of a Caribbean night and the loud, carefree bass of popular music. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Natalie was seen leaving the bar, getting into a silver car with three young men who were not part of her student group. It was a departure that, in the moment, seemed like a minor footnote to a night of celebration. But as the sun rose over the ocean the next morning, that footnote became the start of a mystery that would haunt the island for decades. The absence began not with a frantic call, but with a silent, empty seat on a departing plane. When Natalie failed to meet her classmates for the flight back to Alabama, the atmosphere of the island shifted from celebration to cold mobilization. Her parents arrived in Aruba within hours, sparking a search that combed every square inch of the 12-mile-long island. They looked into the salt flats of the north, the limestone caves along the rugged coast, and the construction sites of the burgeoning hotel district. The Aruban police force, accustomed to low rates of violent crime, was suddenly at the center of a global forensic gaze. They questioned the three young men last seen with her, local residents Joran van der Sloot and brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpo, whose stories began to shift like the wind-blown sands of Eagle Beach, moving from "we dropped her off" to "we left her on the shore," creating a narrative labyrinth with no clear exit. The investigative process was an exercise in profound frustration and international tension. Aruba operated under a legal system that required a high threshold for physical evidence before a long-term detention could be secured. Detectives processing the silver car found it immaculately clean, while Dutch Marines joined the search, using sonar to scan the dark, deep waters off the coast. They looked for a trace of her clothing or the jewelry she had worn that night. But the Caribbean Sea remained a vast, blue blank. The investigation was hampered by the transient nature of a tourist economy. Witnesses were flying out of the country, and the digital footprints of 2005 were sparse compared to the interconnected world of today. The files grew thick with contradictions, but empty of the physical proof needed to bridge the gap between suspicion and a courtroom. Over the years, the Natalie Holloway case became a permanent fixture in the collective memory of the United States and the Netherlands. Her mother, Beth Holloway, maintained a relentless vigil on the island, her presence a constant reminder of the unanswered questions that lingered in the salt air. The narrative took many dark turns, including a series of undercover recordings and public statement from the primary suspect that offered glimpses into potential truths, only for them to be retracted or proven to be fabrications. The case moved through the stages of a modern-day myth, a story of a paradise lost and a search for justice that refused to be silenced by the passage of time or the vastness of the sea. In 2012, a significant legal chapter closed when an Aruban judge declared Natalie legally dead, though the physical reality of her end remained hidden. The investigation into her disappearance remained open, a digital ghost in the cold case files. Then, years later, the primary suspect was involved in a tragedy in Peru, which reignited global interest and eventually led to a complex legal extradition process. It wasn't until 2023, nearly 2 decades after the night at Carlos and Charlie's, that a legal proceeding in a federal courtroom in Alabama provided the first formal acknowledgement of the truth. In a stunning admission as part of a plea deal, the primary suspect finally described the events on the beach, confirming a tragic end that had been suspected for 18 years. The legacy of Natalee Holloway is held within the changes she brought to the world of travel safety and the protection of students abroad. Her name is now synonymous with the Natalee Holloway Resource Center, an organization dedicated to helping the families of missing persons navigate the complexities of international searches. The island of Aruba has continued to flourish, its pastel buildings still bright under the Caribbean sun, but for many, the white sands of the South Coast will always carry a somber weight. Natalee is remembered not just as a headline, but as a bright, ambitious daughter whose journey was cut short in a place meant for joy. Today, the trade winds still lean the DVDV trees toward the water, and the sound of the ocean remains as rhythmic and ancient as ever. The Carlos and Charlies of 2005 is gone, but the memories of that May night are etched into the stone and the soil of the island. The case has found a form of closure in words, if not in physical restoration, and the truth has finally emerged from the shadows of the trade winds. Natalee's family has found a somber peace, knowing that the silence of the island has finally been broken. As the evenings settle over the Caribbean, the island remains a place of profound beauty, watched over by a history that has finally found its voice. Next story, The Moors Murders, Manchester and the Peak District, UK, 1963 to 1965. The landscape of the Saddleworth Moor in the early 1960s was a place of stark, ancient isolation, a sprawling plateau of peat bogs and purple heather that rises high above the industrial smog of Manchester. The air in this part of the Pennines is perpetually thin and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the rhythmic whistling of the wind as it cuts through the gritstone outcrops known as clints. Below the moor, the city of Manchester moved with the heavy, coal-fired pulse of the textile era, a world of red brick terraces and narrow alleyways. Between 1963 and 1965, the contrast between the bustling city and the silent, brooding hills became the backdrop for a series of disappearances that would fundamentally alter the sense of safety in the north of England. The mystery did not begin with a single event, but with a growing, cold realization among the families of 5 young people who vanished from the streets of Manchester. It started with Pauline Reed, then John Kilbride, and eventually Keith Bennett, Leslie and West, and Edward Evans. The pattern was invisible to the authorities at first. Children and teenagers simply slipped out of the urban frame, leaving behind mothers and fathers who spent years waiting for the turn of a latch that never moved. The narrative of the city was one of routine: school runs, grocery trips, and weekend walks. Yet within that routine, a silver van moved through the streets, occupied by a man and a woman who projected an air of unremarkable local normalcy. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were the architects of the silence that settled over the moor. They were an enigmatic pair who lived in a modest terrace house on Wardlebrook Avenue, surrounded by neighbors who knew them as a quiet couple with a penchant for long drives in the evening. Hindley, with her distinctive peroxide blonde hair, and Brady, with his cold, detached intellectualism, utilized the vast, shifting geography of the Pennines as a vault for their actions. The investigation only gained momentum in October 1965, when a sudden, terrifying incident at their home led the police to the realization that the missing children of Manchester had not simply run away. The search that followed was an exercise in extreme physical and emotional endurance. Detectives and hundreds of volunteers moved through the treacherous terrain of Saddleworth Moor, using long metal prods to pierce the peat, looking for anomalies in the soil. The atmosphere was one of somber, clinical focus, conducted under the gray, weeping skies of the Manchester winter. They were looking for evidence that the shifting bog had held for years. The moor is a difficult witness. The landscape is repetitive, devoid of trees or landmarks, making the recovery of specific sites a monumental task of memory and mapping. When the first discoveries were made, the quiet of the hills was replaced by a forensic vigil that lasted for months. The investigation was haunted by the presence of a singular piece of audio evidence, a recording made on a reel-to-reel tape that captured the final moments of 10-year-old Leslie and West. This harrowing artifact transformed the legal proceedings from a standard criminal case into a narrative of profound moral gravity. The trial at Chester Assizes in 1966 was conducted in a climate of total national shock, as the details of the Moores murders reveal the level of calculated, existential darkness that the post-war legal system was ill-equipped to process. The files became a record of the fragility of innocence and the capacity for two seemingly ordinary people to curate a world of secret violence. For decades, the case remained unfinished, held in a state of perpetual almost by the geography of the hills. While Brady and Henley were sentenced to life, the location of Keith Bennett remained a secret kept by the Pete. The investigation was reopened in the mid-1980s, sparking a new wave of atmospheric searches that saw the perpetrators return to the moor in handcuffs, attempting to identify the burial sites amidst the featureless heather. The images of these searches, the small figures of investigators silhouetted against the vast, empty horizon, became a symbol of the UK's longest-running mystery. The silence of the moor remained largely absolute, frustrating the modern tools of radar and thermal imaging. Today, the Saddleworth Moor remains a place of pilgrimage and reflection. The wind still sighs through the tall grass, and the mist still rolls in to hide the Clint from view. The families of the victims are remembered for their extraordinary persistence and the dignity they maintained through half a century of waiting. The moors themselves have changed little. They are as ancient and indifferent as they were in 1963, a landscape that holds the memory of the industrial smoke below and the secrets of the peat within. The story of the Moores murders is a story of a landscape that serves as both a tomb and a witness. It is a mystery that highlights the enduring weight of cold cases and the commitment of law enforcement to never abandon the search for the missing. As the evening settles over the Pennines, the hills stand in quiet vigil, watched over by a history that has left its mark on the soul of the North. The world is at rest, and the moor is still, a vast expanse of purple and brown waiting for the final truth to be uncovered by the light of a future morning. Next story, the Bible John Murders, Glasgow, UK, 1968 to 1969. The Glasgow of the late 1960s was a city of grit, steam, and a fierce, industrial soul. The air was often heavy with the scent of coal fires and the damp mist rising off the River Clyde, creating a perpetually gray, atmospheric shroud over the tenements. On Thursday nights, the city found its release in the vibrant, neon-lit dance floors of the Barrowland Ballroom. Inside, the sound of big bands and the rhythmic shuffle of hundreds of feet filled the vast, wooden-floored hall. It was a sanctuary of music and light, where the workers of Glasgow could shed the weight of the week. But within this sanctuary, a shadow began to move, targeting women who had come to the Barrowlands for a dance and a night of escape. The mystery began in early 1968 with the discovery of Patricia Docker. She had spent the evening at the ballroom, her dark coat and sensible shoes found in the freezing morning light near her home. The scene was quiet, devoid of the chaos one might expect from a struggle, suggesting a departure from the ballroom that seemed routine until the final moment. 18 months passed before the pattern repeated with Jemima MacDonald. Again, the Barrowland Ballroom was the common thread. Again, the victim was left in a quiet lane within a mile of the music. The investigation began to focus on the anonymity of the dance floor, a place where a stranger could blend into the rhythmic crowd and vanish just as easily into the wet, midnight streets of the East End. The narrative took on a chilling, religious depth with the third victim, Helen Pudick, in October 1969. On this night, Helen had shared a taxi with her sister and a man she had met at the Barrowlands. The sister later recalled the man's intense, quiet demeanor. He had quoted scripture and spoken with a somber authority about the dens of iniquity that dance halls represented. He called himself John. By the time the taxi reached Helen's stop and she stepped out into the damp Glasgow air, the sister had a lingering sense of unease. Helen was found the next morning, Bible John, was born into the public consciousness, a specter who combined the refinement of a religious scholar with the clinical violence of a predator. The investigation was the largest in the history of the Scottish police at the time. Detectives moved through the Barolins in suits, attempting to blend in with the dancers, sifting through the lives of thousands of patrons. A composite sketch was created, the first in Scotland to be distributed so widely, depicting a man with short, reddish-blonde hair and a distinct, lean face. It stared out from the front pages of every newspaper, a silent landmark in a city gripped by a collective, nocturnal fear. Yet, despite the thousands of calls and the scrutiny of Glasgow's boarding houses, the man from the taxi remained a phantom. He had stepped out of the light of the ballroom and into a silence that the 1960s could not break. Over the years, the Bible John case has become the most enduring cold case in the UK. Theories have flourished in the damp Glasgow nights. Some believe the perpetrator moved overseas, while others scrutinize the lives of convicted individuals who fit the profile. In the late 1990s, the potential of DNA profiling brought a surge of hope. The body of a primary suspect was exhumed, and forensic teams worked in a climate of intense national expectation. But the results were inconclusive, the genetic material too degraded by time to bridge the 30-year gap. The shadow of the man with the scripture remained untouchable, a permanent fixture of the city's folklore. Today, the Barrowland Ballroom still stands, its famous neon sign flickering over the Gallowgate. It is an iconic venue, once again filled with the energy of music and crowds. But for those who walk past on a cold, misty evening, the history of the late 60s still lingers in the gray stone of the neighborhood. The mystery is a reminder of the secrets that can be kept in the most crowded rooms. The victims are remembered not as statistics, but as women who lived in the vibrant, difficult heart of Glasgow. The truth of Bible John remains hidden in the archives of New Scotland Yard and the memories of a generation, waiting for the light to finally reach the back lanes of the East End. Next story, the Greenbrier Ghost Case. West Virginia, 1897. The atmosphere of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, in the late 19th century was defined by its deep, rugged geography. This was a place of Appalachian isolation, characterized by towering, mist-shrouded peaks, narrow, winding valleys, and dense, dark forests that seemed to swallow the light. The air was perpetually cool, smelling of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint, coppery scent of the creek water running over limestone. The small, close-knit farming community of Richlands, nestled in one of these remote valleys, operated under a sense of quiet permanence, its rhythm dictated by the seasons and the hard work of agriculture. The soundscape was primarily natural, the rustle of wind through the heavy canopy, the distant clip-clop of a horse, the lowing of cattle, and the absolute silence that fell after sundown, a silence so profound it seemed to amplify the smallest domestic sound, the crackle of a wood stove, the creak of floorboards. The light was clean, rural, and unforgiving, either brilliant and sharp or completely extinguished by the heavy mountain night. It was into this outwardly placid, deeply rooted environment that the tragedy of Zona Hester Shue unfolded. Zona was a young woman, described as having a pleasant, gentle nature. In October 1896, she married Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, known locally as Edward. Shue was a blacksmith, a man of some height and outward charm, but a newcomer to the county with a mysterious, unsettling past. The couple lived in a simple, rented cabin in the valley. On January 23, 1897, Edward Shue dispatched a young neighbor boy, Andy Jones, to the house on an errand. The boy found Zona's body at the foot of the stairs, lying in an unnatural position. The geography of the small cabin, its confinement and domesticity, was the first constraint of the crime scene. Edward Shue arrived shortly after the discovery. His behavior at the scene was immediate and possessive. Before the county doctor, George Knapp, could arrive and perform a proper examination, Shue had already moved his wife's body to the upstairs bedroom and, with a strange, nervous diligence, dressed her in a high-necked gown with a heavily starched collar. He then placed a large silk scarf or veil over her face. When Dr. Knapp finally arrived at the small cabin after a difficult ride, he found Shue guarding the body, weeping dramatically. The doctor attempted an examination, but was repeatedly obstructed by Edward, who clutched his wife's head and neck, preventing Knapp from thoroughly examining the area around her throat, weeping that the sight caused Zona discomfort. Given the remoteness of the location and the lack of visible injury, a testament to Shue's careful concealment, Knapp, a busy practitioner, relied on Edward's tearful explanation. Zona had suffered an everlasting faint or complications from earlier illness. The official cause of death was recorded as everlasting faint. Zona Shue was quickly buried in a simple service, and the community, sympathetic to the bereaved husband, assumed the matter was closed. The rugged geography of the county seemed to promise that the secret would be buried with her. The official narrative was accepted by all but one person, Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester. Mrs. Hester was an elderly woman steeped in the spiritual and cultural traditions of the Appalachian region. She harbored a profound, visceral distrust of her son-in-law. For weeks following the burial, Mary Jane maintained that her daughter's spirit was restless and unable to find peace. Then, for weeks after Zona's death, Mary Jane claimed to have received a series of visits from her daughter's specter, the Greenbrier ghost. According to Mary Jane, the ghostly visitations occurred over 4 successive nights, in the intimate, quiet space of her own bedroom. The spirit, Mary Jane claimed, described her murder in chilling detail. The ghost informed her mother that Edward Shue was a cruel man, and that he had murdered her in a fit of rage after she refused to cook meat for him. The spirit revealed the precise mechanism of death. Edward had violently snapped her neck at the first and second cervical vertebrae. To prove the truth of her claim, the ghost, in Mary Jane's telling, turned her head completely around, showing the mechanism of the break. Mary Jane Hester was not merely grieving. She was convinced. She immediately took her story to the local prosecutor, Colonel John Alfred Preston. In the remote, pragmatic setting of Greenbrier County, a murder investigation prompted by a supernatural claim should have been dismissed instantly. Yet, Preston was a methodical, civic-minded man. He knew of the community's disquiet regarding Edward Shue's behavior and Dr. Knapp's rushed examination. More critically, he was aware of the dark rumors about Edward Shue's past, which included a previous marriage that had ended in a hasty, unexplained death. The geographical isolation of the area provided a perfect shield for Shue's pattern of behavior. Preston ordered the exhumation of Zona Shue's body. The legal order was served on Edward Shue, whose composure instantly shattered. He flew into a hysterical rage, loudly protesting the exhumation in the town square. His frantic opposition only served to solidify the community's suspicions. On February 22, 1897, Zona's coffin was raised from the grave in the quiet cemetery and transported to the local one-room schoolhouse for the autopsy. The local atmosphere was electric with quiet tension. Under the intense scrutiny of local officials and a crowd of silent, watchful neighbors, Dr. Knapp and 2 other doctors performed a detailed postmortem. The findings confirmed the ghost claims. The examination of the neck revealed that the cervical vertebrae were indeed fractured. Specifically, the first and second vertebrae were broken, and the ligaments in the neck were severed, a condition that would only be possible if the head had been violently twisted or wrenched. The high collar and thick scarf, placed so carefully by Edward Shue, had been an effective, if simple, means of concealment against a casual medical glance. Edward Shue was immediately arrested. The subsequent trial was held in the Greenbrier County Courthouse, bringing a surge of outsiders to the quiet mountain town. Prosecutor Preston, in an audacious move, introduced Mary Jane Hester's testimony, the visitation of the ghost, not as evidence of fact, but as the catalyst that led to the discovery of the physical, forensic evidence of murder. The defense lawyer spent considerable time attempting to discredit Mary Jane's testimony, only to inadvertently give the ghost's account wide public attention. The jury, composed of local men who understood the complex weave of folklore, community obligation, and forensic reality, was out for less than an hour. Edward Shue was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died in the West Virginia Penitentiary a few years later. The legacy of the Greenbrier ghost is unique. It is the only case in American legal history where the testimony of a purported spectral entity led directly to the conviction of a murderer. While the cause of the conviction was the shattered neck vertebrae, the physical reality, the catalyst for the discovery was Mary Jane Hester's absolute, unwavering conviction based on her supernatural encounters. Today, Greenbrier County is still a place of imposing hills and quiet valleys. The cabin is gone, but the courthouse still stands. The atmosphere of the region still holds that blend of quiet community and deep, isolated mystery. The story is permanently etched into the local geography, a reminder that in places where the mountains keep their own counsel and the silence is immense, sometimes the secrets of the dead are brought to light not by witnesses in the flesh, but by a mother's conviction and the chilling narrative of an Appalachian ghost. Next story, The Torsos of the Thames. London, England, 1887 to 1889. Imagine standing on the muddy bank of the River Thames on a cold, gray afternoon in the late 1880s. The water is a churning, brackish mass, moving with the relentless pull of the tide, carrying with it the entire foul history of London. The geographical atmosphere of the Thames is one of industrial melancholy. The air is always heavy, saturated with the smell of coal smoke from 1,000 hearths, the pungent aroma of wet ropes and diesel from the tugs, and the deep, organic rot of the exposed foreshore mud at ebb tide. This is the central artery of Victorian London, a liquid landscape of commerce and secrecy, bounded by the dark brick canyons of the city and its sprawling docklands. The soundscape is a constant, low-frequency hum, the mournful hollow blare of ships' horns in the fog, the echoing shouts of dock workers from the Pool of London, and the heavy, sloshing sigh of the river itself, perpetually grinding the gravel and debris against the ancient stone embankments. The light, even at midday, struggles to penetrate the persistent, sooty haze that hangs over the water. It is a place of deep, atmospheric gloom, a perfect, expansive setting for things to be taken, lost, and then returned, irrevocably altered by the current. The mystery began quietly, without fanfare, in the late spring of 1887. On May 11th, a police constable patrolling the river near Rainham, far downriver in Essex, made a gruesome find: a human torso, wrapped in a coarse cloth, floating near the shoreline. It was the remains of a woman, carefully disarticulated, the head, limbs, and external organs professionally removed. The remaining structure had been expertly stripped of flesh, leaving a bony mass of torso and hips. The water had cleansed the evidence, but the manner of preparation spoke volumes of skill and calculation. This was not an isolated event. Over the next 2.5 years, more fragments emerged from the thick, opaque flow of the river. The locations of discovery were geographically disparate, stretching along the tidal portion of the Thames from Westminster and Lambeth in the heart of the city, out past the docks to Rainham and eventually the mouth of the river. The findings followed a grim, consistent pattern that suggested a single, terrifying source. June 4th, 1888, Pimlico, a left leg and foot, found near the High Society district, suggesting the killer was active in the city center, or merely using the river's extensive flow to dispose of evidence from that region. September 10th, 1888, Whitehall, a human female arm and hand, retrieved from the river adjacent to Scotland Yard itself. A gesture of chilling proximity that deeply unnerved the authorities. June 5th, 1889, Horsley Down, a partially submerged torso, discovered floating near ships, mooring. This was confirmed to be a different woman than the previous finds, again meticulously dissected. The cases quickly became known in the press as the Thames Torso Murders. The method was the forensic key. The victims were all women, typically heavy-set, and had all been subjected to a highly skilled process of dismemberment. The cuts were not random or frantic. They were precise, indicating a knowledge of human anatomy, suggesting the involvement of someone with medical, veterinary, or butchery experience. The killer was clearly utilizing the massive, liquid geography of the Thames not just as a dumping ground, but as a distribution mechanism, scattering the parts to ensure identification was virtually impossible. The river, with its relentless, obliterating currents, was effectively the killer's accomplice. The police faced enormous geographical and logistical challenges. The crime spanned multiple police jurisdictions: the Metropolitan Police, the City of London Police, and the Thames River Police, all of which struggled to coordinate their efforts on the fast-moving body of water. Crucially, the absence of heads and limbs meant that the foundational requirement for an 1880s murder investigation, identification, was entirely absent. Without a name, there was no starting point, no means to determine the victim's history, associates, or last known movements. The investigation took on an unusual direction because of the geographic context. The finds were happening concurrently with the infamous Whitechapel murders of 1888. The police were under intense pressure to link the two sets of crimes, given the brutal nature of the attacks. However, forensic analysis argued against the connection. The Whitechapel victims were not dismembered beyond the mutilation of internal organs in some cases, and the crime scenes were confined to street. The Thames victims were primarily dismembered, and the only scene was the flowing river itself. The Thames torso killer was fundamentally different, focused on disposal, not public display. One piece of potential forensic evidence emerged with the torso found in Battersea in September 1888. A piece of clothing known as a chemise was wrapped around the remains. Police used this cloth to attempt to trace the murder back to the London laundry trade, but the trail went cold quickly. The most notable attempt at identification involved the remains found in 1889, which the press dubbed the Pinchin Street torso, though it was found in Horsley Down. This torso was eventually identified through a process of elimination and a rare surviving article of clothing as Elizabeth Jackson, a woman of the impoverished working class. This breakthrough, though late, allowed investigators to establish that she was last seen in the Whitechapel area, reinforcing the proximity of the killer's operations to the East End. Despite the identification of Jackson, the investigation stalled. The lack of a head or limbs meant no definitive cause of death beyond the dismemberment itself. The police were left with theories. Perhaps a medical student run amok, a sadistic butcher, or a sailor with a knowledge of anatomy who could move fluidly between the docks and the city. The Thames, being a porous barrier, gave the killer the perfect fluid escape route. The murders ceased as abruptly as they began. The last confirmed finding linked to the case occurred in 1889. The ultimate identity and motive of the Thames torso killer were never established. The cases remain cold, overshadowed by the more sensational, less geographically dispersed terror of Jack the Ripper. The river, however, retains the essential memory of the crime. Today, the tidal Thames remains a dark, powerful force, sweeping past the glass towers and steel bridges of modern London. The water is cleaner, the smell of coal is gone, but the sound of the relentless pull of the tide against the shore remains unchanged. It is a continuous, indifferent mechanism, silently reminding the city that its vastness and complexity are not just arteries of commerce, but perfect, shifting graves, capable of both revealing and eternally obscuring the secrets poured into its flow. Next story: the murder of William Golden Supp. East River, New York, 1897. The East River in the winter of 1897 was less a river and more a moving, chaotic corridor of frigid brine and refuse, separating the dense, clamorous sprawl of Manhattan from the industrial docks and burgeoning neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Long Island City. The geographical atmosphere was one of profound urban anonymity. The air, particularly after a cold snap, carried the sharp, biting scent of raw salt mixed with the pervasive, sulfurous odor of the city's millions of coal stoves and factory exhausts. The soundscape of this region was dominated by the immense, non-stop machinery of New York. The ceaseless, vibrating thrum of ferryboats and tugs, the grating shriek of iron wheels on the elevated rail lines that hugged the waterfront, and the deep, echoing slosh of water against the pilings of the piers. The light was harsh and cold, reflecting off the oily surface of the water, a dim winter glare that failed to penetrate the deep shadows cast by the looming truss bridges and the vast, dark profiles of anchored ships. This was a place where things disappeared easily, shrouded by fog, swallowed by the tide, or simply lost in the overwhelming physical and social complexity of the port. The events that would rivet the city began in the first week of February 1897. The initial discovery was made on the Manhattan side of the river, near the docks of the East 11th Street ferry slip. On Tuesday, February 2nd, a police officer on patrol noticed a large, rolled-up bundle floating near the bulkhead. Upon retrieving it, the officer made a horrifying determination. The package contained the heavily mutilated, partially decomposed torso of a human male. The forensic reality was shocking. The head, limbs, and all internal organs had been meticulously removed. The remains were heavy-set, suggesting a robust frame. The discovery was not singular. Over the next 2 weeks, the East River and its tributaries became the unwilling repository for more fragments of the same body, scattered geographically across the entire metropolitan area. The tidal flow had carried the evidence far and wide, making the river the primary obstacle to the investigation. February 4th. Harlem River, a left leg and foot, were discovered miles away, near the High Bridge, floating in the dark, tributary waters of the Harlem River. February 7th. East 84th Street Pier, the second leg, similarly severed, was found near Manhattan Pier. February 15th. Brooklyn, the head, wrapped in a black cloth and showing signs of crushing blow that was likely the cause of death, washed ashore on the Brooklyn side of the river. The sheer volume and wide geographic distribution of the remains made the case impossible to ignore. The press quickly dubbed it the Golden Sup Murder, after the initial identification of the victim. Through examining the fingerprints and distinctive markings on the torso, specifically a healed scar and evidence of his profession, police identified the victim as William Goldensup, a 35-year-old German-American bathhouse attendant who worked in the high-end establishment of the Murray Hill Baths. The identification of Goldensup immediately shifted the geographical focus of the investigation from the chaotic waterfront to the specific, confined space of his life, the bathhouse and his lodgings in Manhattan. Detectives quickly homed in on two primary figures in his close circle, a triangle of bitter jealousy and financial motive. The central figures were August Knack, a middle-aged, diminutive pharmacist who ran a respected apothecary in East 16th Street, and his mistress, Maria Barbella, a married, fiery Italian immigrant known for her dramatic emotional swings. Barbella had been having a tumultuous affair with Goldensup, often meeting him at Knack's apartment, a dark, third-floor residence above the pharmacy. The apartment was the contained, silent center of the crime, a domestic space violently ruptured. The motive was quickly established as jealousy and control. Knack, obsessed with Barbella and paranoid about Goldensup, convinced Barbella that the bath attendant was planning to leave her and expose their illicit relationship. The two conspired to eliminate Goldensup. The murder itself took place within the confines of Knack's apartment. Goldensup was lured there on January 25th under the pretense of a late-night rendezvous with Barbella. Once inside, Knack struck Goldensup with a sharp, heavy blow to the head, likely an axe or a large club, killing him instantly. The most horrific and telling phase of the crime followed, the meticulous dismemberment. The process, executed by Knack, revealed a cool, methodical mindset. The victim was severed into pieces, allegedly using surgical tools from the pharmacy, and then packaged for disposal. The geographical atmosphere of the East River was the killer's co-conspirator. The body parts were then loaded onto a small rowboat and scattered individually into the tidal currents, guaranteeing that the pieces would never be found together. Knack assumed the river's vastness and perpetual flow would ensure the absolute disappearance of the evidence. Knack and Barbella were quickly arrested after the discovery of the head and the establishment of Goldensup's relationships. The subsequent trial of August Knack was a sensation, focusing on the sheer depravity of the dismemberment and the calculated use of the river to dispose of the body. Knack broke down and confessed, implicating Barbella, but taking primary responsibility for the murder and the disarticulation. Maria Barbella was also tried separately, initially convicted, but the verdict was later overturned due to legal errors, and she was eventually acquitted after a second trial. Knack, however, was convicted and executed in 1899. His confession detailed the process of dismemberment and the eerie boat ride across the frigid river, throwing the wrapped fragments one by one into the current, relying on the geographical complexity of the city's waterways to hide his deed. The Golden Sup murder became one of the most famous anatomical crimes of the Gilded Age, setting a chilling precedent for the use of the urban environment as a means of crime concealment. The East River, the central geographical feature of the disposal, became permanently linked to the crime. Today, the waterfront of the East River is lined with parks and towering modern residences. The elevated trains are gone, replaced by subterranean lines, and the industrial odor has largely dissipated. But the river itself remains a powerful, dark force. When standing on one of the Brooklyn or Manhattan bridges, looking down into the rapid flow of the water, one can still sense the vast, cold capacity of the current. It is an immense, ceaseless geographical force that, in the late 19th century, was considered the perfect accomplice, an ultimate, indifferent mechanism capable of dissolving all human trace and ensuring that the remains of a man, taken in a small, dark room, would be scattered into the cold, chaotic anonymity of the world's fastest-moving city. Next story. The disappearance of Lauren Spirer, Bloomington, Indiana, 2011. The college town of Bloomington in the early hours of June morning is defined by a heavy, Midwestern humidity and the quiet, blue glow of street lamps reflecting off empty limestone buildings. The vibrant energy of the school year had given way to the slower, thick air of the summer session. On the night of June 2nd, the atmosphere was one of celebration. Graduation was near, and the downtown area was filled with the rhythmic bass of music drifting from open bar doors and the steady chatter of students moving through the warm night. Lauren Spirer, a 20-year-old sophomore with a slight frame and a quick smile, was part of this nocturnal landscape, moving between friends' apartments and a local establishment known as Kilroy Sports Bar. The mystery began to coalesce during the transition from the night's festivities to the morning silence. Lauren was last captured on a security camera at a luxury apartment complex around 2:51 a.m., walking barefoot into the night, having left her shoes and phone behind earlier in the evening. Witnesses reported seeing her continue toward a street corner at 4:30 a.m., a slight figure walking alone through the shadows of the Smallwood Plaza area. When the sun rose over the Indiana University campus, the humid air remained, but Lauren was gone. The disappearance was not marked by a struggle or a scream, but by a sudden, absolute absence that left the bustling downtown area feeling hollow. The investigation was launched into a city that was suddenly on edge. Thousands of volunteers and law enforcement officers fanned out across the rolling hills of Monroe County, searching the dense woods, the local quarries, and the sprawling landfill sites that serve the region. The air in Bloomington was filled with the sound of search helicopters and the constant rustle of people moved through the brush. Detectives looked into the digital and physical tracks of everyone who had been with Lauren that night, sifting through hours of surveillance footage that caught fragments of her movement, yet never showed the moment she crossed the threshold into the unknown. As weeks turned into months, the investigation focused on the unique social geometry of a college town. Leads took investigators into the surrounding counties and beyond state lines, looking for a vehicle or a person who had been out in those early morning hours. Every quarry was scanned, every construction site scrutinized, but the Indiana earth held its secrets. The forensic evidence was sparse. The lack of a struggle at her last known location suggesting a departure that was either voluntary or chillingly efficient. The files became a labyrinth of timelines and conflicting recollections, a narrative blurred by the late-hour environment of the night she vanished. Over the years, the search for Lauren Spirer has become a permanent fixture of the Bloomington consciousness. Her parents have maintained a constant presence in the state, their advocacy for the truth serving as a beacon for other families of the missing. The mystery has been revisited by every major investigative agency, utilizing advancements in technology that didn't exist in 2011, yet the core of the case remains static. It is a story that highlights the vulnerability of the individual in the quiet, shadowed transition between the city's vibrant night and its silent dawn. Today, the intersection where Lauren was last reported remains a busy hub of student life. The limestone buildings still stand, and the humidity of the Indiana summer continues to settle over the town every June. But for those who remember, the air carries a weight of unfinished business. The search continues in the quiet efforts of cold case investigators and the persistent hope of a community that refuses to forget. The truth of Lauren's final walk remains hidden in the geometry of the Bloomington streets, waiting for a single piece of evidence to break the decade-long silence. Next story, the Lane Bryant shooting, Tinley Park, Illinois, 2008. The suburban landscape of Tinley Park in February 2008 was characterized by a biting, Midwestern chill and the quiet, orderly routine of a Saturday morning. The air was sharp with the scent of frozen pavement and the faint, metallic hint of a coming snow. At the Brookside Marketplace, a shopping center defined by its clean, modern architecture and expansive parking lots, the day began with the predictable sounds of a weekend. The distant hum of traffic on I-80 and the rhythmic opening and closing of heavy glass storefront doors. Inside the Lane Bryant boutique, the atmosphere was serene and brightly lit, a sanctuary of retail normalcy where the employees were preparing for a busy shift. But at 10:44 a.m., the quiet professional rhythm of the store was breached by an arrival that felt entirely foreign to the setting. The mystery began with a call to emergency services that consisted of a frantic, whispered plea for help. The voice on the other end was barely audible against a backdrop of chilling silence. When the police arrived minutes later, they found a scene that defied the expectations of a routine robbery. In a back storage room, tucked away from the elegant displays of the showroom, 5 women had lost their lives. A 6th woman had survived, though the psychological weight of the encounter would remain as heavy as the winter air. The perpetrator had vanished as effectively as a shadow passing through a doorway, leaving behind no digital signature, no getaway vehicle identified by the sprawling security networks of the center, and no clear motive beyond a small amount of cash taken from the register. The investigation was launched into a climate of profound regional shock. Tinley Park was a community built on a foundation of perceived safety, and the clinical nature of the crime suggested a level of planning and cold detachment that haunted the public imagination. Detectives from across the state converged on the marketplace, meticulously processing the store for a trace of a stranger. They sifting through thousands of hours of surveillance footage from the surrounding interstates and secondary roads, looking for a singular vehicle that didn't belong. They found a few discarded items and a singular DNA profile that didn't match any known database, leaving the investigation to rely on the memory of the survivor and the few forensic fragments that the winter morning had left behind. In the weeks that followed, a detailed sketch of the suspect was released. A man with a calm, methodical demeanor and a unique, braided hairstyle adorned with a single bead. This image became a fixture of the regional news, staring back from posters and television screens, yet it led to a labyrinth of dead ends. Investigators traveled as far as the East Coast and the Deep South, following leads on individuals who fit the description, but the forensic bridge between the suspect and the DNA recovered at the scene remained unbuilt. The mystery took on a persistent, rhythmic quality. Every anniversary of the event brought a fresh wave of tips, yet the truth remained obscured by the passage of time and the anonymity of the perpetrator. Over the years, the Lane Bryant store remained a closed, silent space before eventually being converted to a memorial and then reimagined for a new purpose. The memory of the women, Rhoda, Connie, Jennifer, Sarah, and Carrie, is held by a community that refuses to let the event define their lives, but rather their collective resilience. The investigation remains one of the most high-priority cold cases in the history of the Illinois State Police. A digital file that is revisited with every breakthrough in genetic genealogy and forensic science. Today, the Brookside Marketplace is once again a bustling hub of activity. The white snow falls on the parking lots just as it did in 2008, and the hum of the interstate remains constant. Yet, for those who move through the center, there's a quiet awareness of the absence left by that February morning. The case remains a testament to the persistent search for justice, a vigil for 5 lives lost in a moment of inexplicable violence. The truth is kept somewhere in the quiet files of the detectives, waiting for a final, forensic key to unlock the silence of the past. Next story, the Hammersmith Nudes Murders, London, UK, 1964 to 1965. The London of the mid-1960s was a city of stark contrasts, caught between the lingering soot of the industrial past and the neon-lit energy of the swinging 60s. Away from the bright boutiques of Carnaby Street, the River Thames cut a dark, cold path through the heart of the capital. Along the Hammersmith stretch, the air was often heavy with the smell of river silt and low-tide mud, and the narrow alleyways were illuminated by a pale, yellow street lamp glow that didn't quite reach the shadows of the riverside warehouses. It was in this gritty, atmospheric environment that a series of discoveries began to unnerve a city that thought it had seen the worst of the post-war era. Between 1964 and 1965, the remains of several women were found abandoned in various quiet corners of West London. The victims were discovered in a state that stripped them of their dignity and their history, left in plain sight, but in locations that suggested a clinical knowledge of the city's nocturnal rhythms. The pattern was chilling. The women were all found without clothing, a detail that led the British press to dub the perpetrator Jack the Stripper. This wasn't the work of a disorganized mind. The scenes were devoid of traditional forensic evidence, suggesting a man who moved through the fog-drenched streets with a calculated, terrifying anonymity. The investigation became one of the largest and most complex in the history of the Metropolitan Police. Chief Superintendent John Dew Rose led a task force that operated out of a heightened, urgent atmosphere. They interviewed thousands of residents and scrutinized the lives of delivery drivers, night watchmen, and those who worked on the river. The difficulty lay in the transient nature of the victims' lives. Many were women living on the margins of society, moving through the boarding houses and basement flats of Notting Hill and Shepherd's Bush. They were women who existed in the cracks of the city's facade, and their disappearance was often not noted until the river or a construction site gave up its secret. Forensic science of the 1960s offered limited tools, yet the detectives found a strange, recurring clue. On several of the victims, traces of industrial paint were discovered, specifically a type of paint used in the automotive and manufacturing industries. This shifted the focus of the search to the sprawling industrial estates that lined the Thames, where the hum of machinery and the scent of solvent were a constant part of the landscape. Detectives moved through workshops and garages, looking for a man whose clothes carried the same microscopic flecks of color, hoping to bridge the gap between the dark riverbanks and a specific factory floor. Despite the intensity of the manhunt, the case produced no smoking gun. Suspects were identified, including a local security guard and a professional boxer. Yet the evidence remained circumstantial, a collection of coincidences that didn't quite lock into a conviction. One prominent suspect took his own life shortly after being questioned, leaving a note that suggested he could no longer live under the weight of suspicion. But his guilt was never forensically proven. The killings stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving the investigation to stall in the cold reality of the late 1960s. The legacy of the Hammersmith Nudes remains a haunting chapter in London's history. It is a story of the other London, the one that existed beneath the glamour of the pop culture explosion, where the fog still clung to the cobblestones and the river held its breath. The victims are remembered now not as tabloid headlines, but as women who were failed by the safety of their city. Names like Hannah Tailford, Irene Lockwood, and Elizabeth Figg represent a somber registry of lives cut short in a landscape of concrete and water. Today, the Hammersmith riverfront has been transformed by modern development. lined with glass-fronted apartments and quiet walkways. The industrial paint shops are gone, and the darkness of the 1960s alleyways has been replaced by the steady, white light of LED lamps. Yet, when the mist rolls in off the Thames on a cold winter night, the atmosphere of the mystery remains. The case remains open in the annals of New Scotland Yard, a reminder that some shadows in the city's past never truly dissipate. The river continues to flow, a silent witness to a year of terror that the truth has yet to fully illuminate. Next story. The murder of Sarah Everard, Clapham to Kent, UK, 2021. The atmosphere of South London in early March 2021 was defined by a quiet, collective endurance. The city was under the stillness of a national lockdown, turning the usually vibrant arteries of Brixton and Clapham into echoing corridors of brick and pavement. The air was sharp with the remaining bite of winter, carrying the scent of damp concrete and the faint, sweet promise of early spring blossoms. In this muted landscape, the simple act of walking home became a vital connection to the world outside. Sarah Everard, a 33-year-old marketing executive with a bright, empathetic spirit, moved through this quiet urban grid on the evening of March 3rd, leaving a friend's house in Clapham around 9 p.m. She wore a bright rain jacket and moved with the purposeful pace of someone comfortable in her neighborhood, her presence captured by the rhythmic glow of street lamps and the silent vigil of doorbell cameras. The mystery did not begin with a disappearance in the dark, but with a terrifying breach of authority in the glare of the streetlights. Sarah was walking along the A205 Pointers Road, a wide, well-lit thoroughfare, when she was intercepted by a silver car. In a landscape where the police were the keepers of a lockdown routine, the encounter appeared to any passing observer as a formal stop. But as the car moved away from the city toward the dark, wooded edges of Kent, the sanctuary of the public street was revealed to have been a stage for a clinical, predatory deception. The night air grew heavy with the unasked questions of the city. When Sarah failed to arrive home, the silence of her apartment became a void that would soon spark a national reckoning. The investigation was launched into a city that was suddenly profoundly on edge. Detectives fanned out across South London, sifting through thousands of hours of grainy CCTV and ANPR data, looking for a singular vehicle that moved against the rhythm of the night. The search led them away from the vibrant light of London to the dense, silent woodlands near Ashford, Kent. In the quiet thickets of Great Chart, forensic teams in white suits worked under the heavy, gray skies of the English spring, looking for a trace of the life that had been taken from the city streets. The air in the woods was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth, a stark contrast to the urban landscape of Clapham Common. The breakthrough came with a speed that mirrored the clinical nature of the crime. The driver of the silver car was identified as a serving officer of the Metropolitan Police. This revelation transformed the narrative from a standard criminal investigation into a seismic crisis of trust. The files of the case revealed a man who had utilized his warrant card and the authority of the lockdown to stage a false arrest. The tragedy shifted from the local to the systemic, focusing on the vulnerability of individuals when the very keepers of safety become the perpetrators of violence. The Sarah Everard mystery was solved in a forensic sense, yet the human and social impact remained an open wound. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the focus shifted to the collective memory of the city. A vigil held at Clapham Common became a symbol of a movement, thousands of women reclaiming the night air and demanding a world where a walk home was a right, not a risk. The silence of the pandemic was replaced by a powerful, communal voice. The perpetrator was sentenced to a whole life tariff, a rarity in the British legal system that reflected the gravity of the betrayal of his office. The investigation into the culture that allowed such an individual to remain in power became a permanent registry of the need for reform. The legacy of Sarah Everard is held within the quiet, respectful dignity of the tributes left for her across the country. Her name is synonymous with a cultural shift toward the safety of women and the accountability of authority. The streets of Clapham have reclaimed their routine. The street lamps still cast their warm light on the pavement, and the early spring blossoms still bloom every March. Yet for those who walk the A205, the air carries a weight of somber reflection, a reminder of the night the city's heart was breached. Today, the woods in Kent are silent once again, and the Atlantic breeze remains steady and cool as it reaches the south of England. Sarah is remembered not as a victim of a crime, but as a vibrant woman whose journey home became the catalyst for a global conversation. The investigation into the systemic failures has concluded, but the vigilance of the community remains. As the evening settles over South London, the neighborhood sleeps with the knowledge that the truth was reached through the persistence of memory and the demands of justice. The streets are calm, the city continues to move, and the name Sarah Everard remains a bright, guiding light in the ongoing search for a safer world. Next story, the Bible John Murders, Glasgow, UK, 1968 to 1969. The Glasgow of the late 1960s was a city of grit, steam, and a fierce, industrial soul. The air was often heavy with the scent of coal fires and the damp mist rising off the River Clyde, creating a perpetually gray, atmospheric shroud over the tenements. On Thursday nights, the city found its release in the vibrant, neon-lit dance floors of the Barrowland Ballroom. Inside, the sound of big bands and the rhythmic shuffle of hundreds of feet filled the vast, wooden-floored hall. It was a sanctuary of music and light, where the workers of Glasgow could shed the weight of the week. But within this sanctuary, a shadow began to move, targeting women who had come to the Barrowlands for a dance and a night of escape. The mystery began in early 1968 with the discovery of Patricia Docker. She had spent the evening at the ballroom, her dark coat and sensible shoes found in the freezing morning light near her home. The scene was quiet, devoid of the chaos one might expect from a struggle, suggesting a departure from the ballroom that seemed routine until the final moment. 18 months passed before the pattern repeated with Jemima MacDonald. Again, the Barrowland Ballroom was the common thread. Again, the victim was left in a quiet lane within a mile of the music. The investigation began to focus on the anonymity of the dance floor, a place where a stranger could blend into the rhythmic crowd and vanish just as easily into the wet, midnight streets of the East End. The narrative took on a chilling, religious depth with the third victim, Helen Pudick, in October 1969. On this night, Helen had shared a taxi with her sister and a man she had met at the Barrowlands. The sister later recalled the man's intense, quiet demeanor. He had quoted scripture and spoken with a somber authority about the dens of iniquity that dance halls represented. He called himself John. By the time the taxi reached Helen's stop and she stepped out into the damp Glasgow air, the sister had a lingering sense of unease. Helen was found the next morning. Bible John was born into the public consciousness, a specter who combined the refinement of a religious scholar with the clinical violence of a predator. The investigation was the largest in the history of the Scottish police at the time. Detectives moved through the Barrowlands in suits, attempting to blend in with the dancers, sifting through the lives of thousands of patrons. A composite sketch was created, the first in Scotland to be distributed so widely, depicting a man with short, reddish-blonde hair and a distinct, lean face. It stared out from the front pages of every newspaper, a silent landmark in a city gripped by a collective, nocturnal fear. Yet, despite the thousands of calls and the scrutiny of Glasgow's boarding houses, the man from the taxi remained a phantom. He had stepped out of the light of the ballroom and into a silence that the 1960s could not break. Over the years, the Bible John case has become the most enduring cold case in the UK. Theories have flourished in the damp Glasgow nights. Some believe the perpetrator moved overseas, while others scrutinize the lives of convicted individuals who fit the profile. In the late 1990s, the potential of DNA profiling brought a surge of hope. The body of a primary suspect was exhumed, and forensic teams worked in a climate of intense national expectation. But the results were inconclusive, the genetic material too degraded by time to bridge the 30-year gap. The shadow of the man with the scripture remained untouchable, a permanent fixture of the city's folklore. Today, the Barrowland Ballroom still stands, its famous neon sign flickering over the Gallowgate. It is an iconic venue, once again filled with the energy of music and crowds. But for those who walk past on a cold, misty evening, the history of the late 60s still lingers in the gray stone of the neighborhood. The mystery is a reminder of the secrets that can be kept in the most crowded rooms. The victims are remembered not as statistics, but as women who lived in the vibrant, difficult heart of Glasgow. The truth of Bible John remains hidden in the archives of New Scotland Yard and the memories of a generation, waiting for the light to finally reach the back lanes of the East End.